dive into the relentless storm rocking America's auto industry. Hit like, subscribe, and share your take on who's really winning and losing in this high-stakes trade war. The American automotive landscape trembles beneath a gathering storm of economic warfare. In boardrooms across Detroit, executives stare at screens displaying plummeting stock values, casualties in a conflict not of their making. Ford Motor Company, once a titan of American industrial might, now stands paralyzed at the edge of the Chinese market. Their vehicles, manufactured with generations of American ingenuity, sit idle in shipping yards, hostages to a trade policy designed in Washington but paid for in Michigan. The company's decision to halt all exports to China wasn't strategic, it was survival. Meanwhile, Buick, clawing its way back from decades of declining relevance, watches helplessly as its renaissance crumbles. The brand's resurgence, carefully engineered through Chinese and South Korean manufacturing partnerships, now collapses under the weight of punitive tariffs. Showroom prices soar beyond the reach of the middle-class buyers they desperately need. Across the Pacific, Japanese automotive giants Toyota, Honda, and Nissan face their own existential crisis. The sudden imposition of a 25% tariff wall around the American market has transformed profitable export strategies into mathematical impossibilities overnight. Vehicles that once symbolized reliability and value now carry the burden of political brinkmanship in their sticker prices. This is not merely a corporate inconvenience. This is economic devastation with human faces. Assembly line workers in Kentucky, dealership employees in California, and parts manufacturers in Ohio, all watching their livelihoods balanced on the edge of political calculations. Industry analyst Jim Cramer doesn't mince words. What we're witnessing isn't protection of American jobs, it's their systematic destruction under the guise of nationalism. In Washington, the architects of these policies present tariffs as weapons of economic patriotism. Yet in the heartland, where metal meets rubber, a different reality emerges. The Chinese government's retaliatory measures weren't unexpected. They were inevitable, targeted precisely at America's most vulnerable economic pressure points. Robert Dyro, geopolitical strategist, warns, "We've miscalculated the willingness of foreign powers to absorb economic pain to win this game of chicken." The automotive sector is just the first domino to fall. In Salt Lake City, protesters gather outside a shuttered parts facility. Their signs don't speak of trade deficits or economic theory. They demand answers about feeding families and paying mortgages. This is where macroeconomic policy meets human consequence head-on. The tariff walls rising around America don't just keep foreign products out, they trap American manufacturers in a shrinking economic prison of their own government's design. And as the engines of industry sputter across the nation, the question remains, who exactly is being protected? Beneath the gleaming showroom floors and executive offices, a financial tsunami gains momentum. American auto manufacturers now face the brutal mathematics of survival as tariffs on imported parts from China, Japan, and Mexico transform supply chains into liabilities. What began as distant policy pronouncements has become an existential reckoning. In Detroit, financial officers at General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler huddle around spreadsheets painted red with projections. Each imported component, from microchips to transmission systems, now carries the invisible weight of political brinkmanship. Production costs aren't merely rising, they're metastasizing. "We're looking at price increases that could reach $4,000 per vehicle," confides a Ford executive who requested anonymity. At those margins, consumer demand doesn't dip, it collapses. The electric vehicle sector, once heralded as American manufacturing's future, faces even steeper challenges. The complex supply chains supporting battery production, largely dependent on Asian materials and expertise, now strain under tariff pressure that could add upwards of $10,000 to each vehicle's price tag. Tesla's ambitious production targets suddenly appear more aspirational than achievable. In parts manufacturing facilities across the Midwest, the human cost materializes. Third-shift workers at Johnson Controls in Michigan receive notice that hours will be reduced as automakers scramble to reevaluate purchasing agreements. Families who survived the 2008 automotive collapse now face familiar uncertainties. The tariff-induced price spiral creates cascading effects that reach far beyond assembly lines. Dealerships in suburban America prepare for inventory shortages and customer sticker shock. Finance departments brace for a wave of canceled orders as monthly payment calculations push vehicles beyond affordability thresholds. The average American can't absorb a $75 increase in their monthly car payment, explains industry analyst Melissa Chen. These tariffs effectively remove entire demographic segments from the new car market overnight. Supply chain managers, once the invisible architects of automotive efficiency, now operate in crisis mode. Alternative sourcing options domestically prove insufficient or non-existent after decades of globalized production optimization. Parts that could once be delivered within 48 hours now face uncertain procurement timelines. In Mexico's manufacturing corridors, where American automakers have invested billions creating integrated production networks, workers face similar uncertainties. The cross-border supply ecosystem, built over decades of careful economic collaboration, now threatens to unravel under artificial trade barriers. Meanwhile, Chinese component manufacturers pivot with alarming efficiency toward European and domestic markets, suggesting that the intended pressure on Beijing may instead accelerate America's industrial isolation. We're witnessing the deindustrialization of America in real time, dressed up as economic patriotism, says economist Martin Reynolds. The automotive sector embodies the paradox. Policies designed to protect American manufacturing are actively dismantling it. As assembly line workers clock out across America's automotive heartland, they enter communities already feeling the economic undertow. The supply chain disruption radiates outward, from the tool and die shops of Michigan, to the logistics companies of Kentucky, to the steel mills of Pennsylvania. The industry's balance, maintained for decades through global integration, now teeters on the edge of fundamental realignment. While American automotive giants struggle against the rising tide of tariffs, halfway across the world, Beijing has been calculating its countermove with cold precision. China's response arrives not as a desperate reaction, but as a devastating chess play in a game they've been preparing for decades. The announcement reverberates through global markets like artillery fire, a 125% tariff on all American exports entering Chinese ports. The precision targeting betrays a strategic mind. Agricultural products from Republican voting states, technological components from innovation hubs, and luxury goods that symbolize American prosperity all face the same brutal mathematics of exclusion. This isn't merely reciprocity, observes Robert Dyro, international finance specialist. It's economic warfare designed to inflict maximum damage where America is most vulnerable. In trading rooms from Shanghai to New York, another seismic aftershock follows. China begins systematically reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, once considered the ultimate safe haven investment. The sell-off isn't panicked, it's methodical. Each transaction sends subtle vibrations through interest rates, threatening the foundation of America's debt-financed economy. Perhaps most alarming to Washington insiders is China's accelerating shift away from dollar-denominated transactions. Oil purchases from Saudi Arabia, infrastructure investments across Asia and Africa, bilateral trade agreements with European partners, all increasingly conducted without touching the American dollar. They're not just retaliating against tariffs, warns Jim Cramer during a particularly somber broadcast. They're building an alternative financial system where America's economic weapons lose their power. The numbers tell a brutal story. American exporters hemorrhage an estimated $40 billion in the first quarter alone. Agricultural communities that survived on Chinese soybean purchases face foreclosures at rates not seen since the 1980s farm crisis. Technology companies watch their Asian market share evaporate as Chinese alternatives receive state backing and preferential treatment. In the diplomatic corridors of power, the language shifts from cooperation to confrontation. Chinese representatives no longer speak of partnership, but of decoupling, a clinical term for the deliberate separation of two economies once deeply intertwined. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seize upon this moment during a rally in Salt Lake City. "The architects of this trade war promised you winning," Sanders thunders to the crowd. "But look who's paying the price. Not the billionaires, not the corporations shifting production overseas, but American workers, farmers, and consumers." The crowd's reaction reflects a growing realization. Economic nationalism has unleashed forces beyond anyone's control. As protest signs wave against the setting sun, their shadows stretch across an economy increasingly divided between those who can weather this storm and those drowning beneath its waves. Meanwhile, in Beijing's financial district, new trade agreements are being signed with countries across the Belt and Road Initiative. Each document, each handshake, each strategic partnership represents another strand in a web of commerce increasingly detached from American influence. "We've awakened a patient adversary," Robert Dyro cautions in a widely shared analysis. one that thinks in terms of decades, not electoral cycles, one that sees economic strength not as an end itself, but as a means to reshape the global order. As automotive workers in Detroit clock out for the weekend, uncertain if their jobs will exist next quarter, Chinese economic planners work through the night. The trade war initiated to correct imbalances has instead accelerated a fundamental realignment of global economic power, one that may leave America's industrial heartland as collateral damage in a conflict its architects severely miscalculated. The American industrial heartland falls silent one factory at a time. At Ford's sprawling Dearborn complex, the assembly lines that once pulsed with 3 shifts of workers now stand idle for entire days. This isn't a temporary slowdown. It's the bleeding edge of an economic hemorrhage threatening to drain the lifeblood from America's automotive sector. The mathematics of destruction is brutally simple. With European markets imposing retaliatory tariffs of 25% on American vehicles, Ford's export strategy collapses overnight. Each vehicle shipped across the Atlantic now carries an impossible burden, priced out of competition before even reaching foreign shores. We're looking at production cuts affecting between 5,000 and 10,000 American jobs in the immediate term, a senior Ford executive reveals in closed-door meetings, his voice betraying the gravity that spreadsheets cannot capture. These aren't just numbers, these are families, communities, generations of manufacturing knowledge at risk. The crisis unfolds like a slow-motion collision. In Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio, suppliers dependent on Ford's production volumes receive the notifications, reduced orders, canceled contracts, delayed payments. The economic shockwave radiates outward, each affected business another fracture in America's industrial foundation. Meanwhile, in Stuttgart and Munich, executives at Mercedes and BMW quietly recalibrate their strategies. American weakness becomes European opportunity. Market share abandoned by Ford's retreat represents territory to be claimed. Investment dollars flow toward expanding German production capacity while Detroit's future dims. What we're witnessing isn't just a company struggling, explains Jim Cramer, gripping his desk with white knuckles during his evening broadcast. This is the unraveling of American industrial primacy that took a century to build and just months to undermine. Perhaps most devastating is the impact on Ford's electric vehicle ambitions. The billions earmarked for next-generation battery plants and research facilities now diverted to simply survive the present crisis. The company's technological future sacrificed on the altar of short-term survival. In Ford's corporate headquarters, the conversations grow increasingly desperate. Executives who once discussed global expansion now huddle over scenarios for salvaging core operations. The phrase existential threat appears in internal communications with alarming frequency. The fundamental miscalculation, Robert Dyro observes during a policy roundtable, was assuming America could dictate terms to a globalized economy. Instead, we've triggered a reshuffling of alliances and supply chains that excludes American interests. Outside a Michigan assembly plant facing its 3rd production cut this quarter, a worker of 27 years removes his hard hat, squinting into the afternoon sun. My father worked Ford, his father before him. What am I supposed to tell my son now? In Washington, officials insist the pain is temporary, necessary sacrifices for long-term American renewal. But on factory floors across the industrial Midwest, workers cleaning out their lockers find little comfort in promises of eventual victory. For them, the trade war isn't an abstract policy debate, but a present reality of foreclosure notices and canceled health insurance. As Ford executives prepare to announce another round of production adjustments, corporate language for human suffering, the competitive landscape of global automotive manufacturing continues its tectonic shift. Each job lost, each factory idled, each market surrendered represents not just current pain, but diminished future possibilities in an industry that once symbolized American economic might. As industrial America bleeds, the voices of dissent grow louder, more urgent. On his primetime financial broadcast, Jim Cramer abandons any pretense of restraint, his face flushed with barely contained fury. This isn't just misguided policy, it's economic self-immolation, Cramer thunders, pounding his desk for emphasis. We're watching trillions in market value evaporate, retirement accounts decimated, manufacturing jobs vanishing. And for what? A fundamental misunderstanding of how modern economies function. The numbers scrolling across screens nationwide tell a story of accelerating decline. Inflation climbing month after month. Consumer confidence plummeting to levels not seen since the Great Recession. The automotive sector, once America's industrial crown jewel, now hemorrhaging both market share and workforce simultaneously. At policy forums and economic summits, Robert Diro's analytical precision cuts through partisan noise with surgical detachment. The most dangerous aspect of this administration's approach, Diro explains to a hushed audience, is not its economic illiteracy, though that's profound. It's the cognitive limitations of those making these decisions. Underestimating Trump's intellectual deficiencies has already cost us dearly. The consequences still to come may be far more severe than many comprehend. In Salt Lake City, the protests that began as small gatherings of displaced auto workers have swelled into something more potent. Thousands now fill downtown plazas, their ranks joined by teachers, nurses, and retail workers, all feeling the crushing weight of economic disintegration. Their signs tell personal stories: lost my job at United Motors, and how do I feed my family on promises? Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez move through these crowds, not as distant political figures, but as vessels for collective outrage. What we're witnessing, Sanders' voice carries over the assembly, is the predictable outcome when government serves corporate interests rather than human needs. The same elites who engineered this disaster will be insulated from its consequences. Meanwhile, in Washington, an atmosphere of unreality persists. Presidential tweets declare victory in battles clearly being lost. Press briefings highlight isolated anecdotes of manufacturing returns while ignoring the broader industrial collapse. The disconnect between political rhetoric and economic reality grows more surreal by the day. In closed-door briefings, Treasury officials present increasingly alarming projections: consumer spending contracting, tax revenues falling, budget deficits widening beyond sustainable levels. A senior economic advisor, requesting anonymity, confides, "We're approaching the point where the damage becomes irreversible." The administration refuses to acknowledge basic economic realities. On factory floors across the nation, the abstractions of policy debates materialize as human suffering. Second and third generation manufacturing families face not just unemployment, but the dissolution of entire communities built around industrial production. Healthcare coverage terminates, mortgage payments fall behind, college plans for children are abandoned. As markets continue their volatile descent, financial analysts increasingly speak in terms reserved for systemic crises. "What we're experiencing isn't a correction," explains a veteran Wall Street strategist. "It's the market pricing in a fundamental restructuring of America's place in the global economy, and that new position appears significantly diminished." In Beijing, officials watch with calculating patience as their strategy unfolds precisely as planned. American industrial retreat creates vacuums in global markets that Chinese manufacturers stand ready to fill. Each factory closure in Detroit or Cleveland represents opportunity in Shenzhen and Shanghai. The trade war intended to cripple Chinese ambitions instead accelerates their ascendance. Salt Lake City shimmers in the late afternoon sun, its gleaming downtown skyline a monument to conservative stability and order. But today, that carefully maintained facade fractures under the weight of unprecedented civic rebellion. Streets once traversed by business professionals and Mormon missionaries now surge with a human tide of dissent. Tens of thousands flood Liberty Park and overflow onto surrounding avenues. The air vibrates with righteous indignation as Bernie Sanders takes the makeshift stage, his weathered hands gripping the podium with the intensity of a man who has waited decades for this moment. What we're witnessing across America isn't just economic hardship, Sanders' voice carries across the crowd, somehow both frail and thunderous. It's the inevitable collapse of a system designed to enrich the few while crushing the many. The crowd, composed not just of displaced auto workers, but teachers, nurses, service industry employees, roars its approval. In this city that voted overwhelmingly conservative in previous elections, the transformation is seismic. Placards demanding wealth taxation and universal health care rise above the masses, like a forest of dissent. Across the stage, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moves with purposeful energy, her presence electrifying as she leans into the microphone. "They thought they could sacrifice your livelihoods for corporate profits and face no consequences," she declares, her voice cutting through the mountain air with razor precision. "They believed Salt Lake City would remain docile, compliant. Look around you. Does this look like compliance?" The answering cheer reverberates between downtown buildings like rolling thunder. What makes this uprising particularly significant is its location. This is not Portland, Oregon, Berkeley, cities with long histories of progressive activism. This is Utah, reliably red, traditionally deferential to authority. Yet the economic devastation wrought by misguided tariffs has catalyzed something revolutionary here. Local organizers move efficiently through the crowd, distributing water and registering voters. Many wear shirts emblazoned with the names of shuttered factories or decimated retirement accounts. Their organization reflects months of building momentum, of community meetings in church basements and union halls, where initial despair transformed gradually into collective resolve. "My father worked 40 years at United Auto," explains Melissa Hardwick, a third-generation manufacturing family now facing foreclosure. "His pension disappeared overnight. My brother lost his job last month. We're not radicals. We just want the system to work for ordinary people again." As dusk approaches, the demonstration shows no signs of dispersing. Police maintain a respectful distance, their commanders recognizing the legitimacy of this peaceful assembly despite its unprecedented scale. Most striking is the demographic diversity. Middle-aged conservatives stand shoulder to shoulder with young progressives. Economic suffering has accomplished what decades of political organizing couldn't: the creation of unlikely coalitions united by shared grievance against a system that has failed them. "This isn't just about one policy or one administration," Sanders continues as streetlights flicker to life. "This is about reclaiming an economy that serves human needs rather than corporate greed. And when the people stand together, as you are today, there is nothing we cannot accomplish." As darkness falls completely, thousands of phone flashlights illuminate the gathering, a constellation of resistance visible from miles away. Something profound has awakened in America's heartland, a reckoning long delayed, but perhaps inevitable. The question now hanging in the cooling evening air: will those in power recognize this awakening before it's too late? Behind the cold statistics of economic fallout lies the human wreckage of America's tariff wars. In Flint, Michigan, disabled veteran Greg House clears his desk at Johnson Controls, the family photo of his 3 daughters, the last item placed in a cardboard box. After 15 years of loyal service, he's become collateral damage in the latest round of layoffs. "They told me it was nothing personal," Greg says, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he carries his belongings to a 9-year-old pickup truck. "Just budget cuts to offset tariff costs. Nothing personal, except I don't know how I'll pay for Melissa's insulin now." Greg's story multiplies across the American landscape by the thousands. What began as isolated economic casualties has transformed into a groundswell of national outrage. From Rust Belt communities to coastal metropolises, Americans who traditionally share little common ground now unite in collective grievance. In Detroit, auto manufacturing plants stand like industrial mausoleums. Once thriving communities surrounding these facilities have become economic ghost towns. The promised renaissance of American manufacturing under protective tariffs has instead delivered devastation, with supply chains fractured and production costs soaring beyond sustainability. Yet official Washington appears unmoved by this suffering. Administration officials dismiss mounting evidence of economic damage as temporary adjustments and necessary sacrifices. The language of political abstraction poorly masks the reality of human desperation, playing out in American homes each night. "We're watching the systematic dismantling of the American working class," declares economics professor Elaine Chao during a televised symposium. "These aren't just jobs being lost, they're entire communities, traditions, and ways of life vanishing, while policymakers remain willfully blind to the consequences." The resistance crystallizes first in unlikely places. Rural counties that voted overwhelmingly conservative now erupt with public demonstrations. Outside a shuttered Buick facility in Janesville, Wisconsin, 3,000 residents block intersections with American flags fluttering above signs reading, "Trade wars equals job losses," and "Forgotten America remembers." Even traditional bastions of establishment support begin wavering. The National Association of Manufacturers, once aligned with protectionist measures, releases a damning report documenting hundreds of thousands of jobs eliminated directly due to retaliatory tariffs and supply chain disruptions. The very policies intended to strengthen American industry are strangling it instead, their statement reads, marking an unprecedented break with administration trade policy. As economic suffering intensifies, social cohesion frays. Hospital emergency rooms report rising cases of stress-related illnesses, substance abuse, and suicide attempts, particularly in communities dependent on manufacturing and agricultural exports. The psychological toll compounds the financial one, creating a national trauma that transcends traditional political divisions. Yet from this shared suffering emerges something unexpected: solidarity. Americans increasingly recognize their common plight transcends the artificial boundaries of partisan politics. They've convinced us for years that our enemies are each other, says Maria Gutierrez at a community meeting in Pennsylvania. But standing here tonight, I see no enemies, just neighbors who all got sold the same false bill of goods. Across America, a consciousness awakens. The narrative of inevitable economic sacrifice for abstract national interests rings increasingly hollow when measured against concrete human suffering. A reckoning approaches, not through traditional political channels, but through the collective will of a people who have discovered, perhaps too late, that their shared interests vastly outweigh their differences. The true power in America has always resided in its people. As they rise from imposed economic devastation, they carry with them a question that haunts those in authority. How long can any system sustain itself when it fails to serve the very citizens whose consent gives it legitimacy? The seismic shifts caused by tariff wars unravel old certainties, revealing that protectionism can devastate industries, ignite social upheaval, and fracture alliances. Ultimately, when leaders gamble with the livelihoods of ordinary citizens for political posturing, the cost is borne by those who can least afford it. Vigilance, informed resistance, and unity remain the people's strongest defense against the reckless tides of economic and political folly.